I'm so excited to be here in the Fat Quarter Shop studio. My name is Gina and I am with Graffiti. I'm one of the long arm quilters here for the Fat Quarter Shop, and today they invited me to come and talk about T-shirt quilts with you, so I'm really excited. T-shirt quilts are a great way to share memories and remember things that were important to you. Like the quilt behind me, I made this for a teenager, and so it has a lot of shirts from him growing up. And the one in front of me was for someone that was big into bicycle riding, and so there's a lot of T-shirts from him doing activities, and so it's a really great way to preserve that memory. So basically we just take the T-shirts and we apply them. There's a lot of different techniques that you can use and a lot of different varieties on how you can kind of lay them out. And so I'm going to talk about some of those things and show you some tips and kind of walk you through the making of the T-shirt quilts. So let's get started. Okay, so one of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to decide what T-shirts that you want to work with. And then the first thing is to cut the T-shirts up. And I know this feels very wrong, but we're going to cut the T-shirts up on the sides, and then we're going to apply a fusible interfacing. That's going to go on the back side of the T-shirt quilt. And so that's what it's going to look like, and I'm going to show you how to cut them out. And this is the way that I cut them. I just leave them, I don't iron them or anything like that. And I start on one corner of the shirt, and I just start from the bottom and I go up, and it does not matter if you're cutting it crooked or anything like that, because you're going to trim it all down. And then I go up to the armpit of the shirt and cut it off at the front, and then I head over to the collar. And so then you're leaving it so that you can see the collar here, and then at this side just go do the same thing, go down to under the arm and then trim it down like that. And then one of the tricks that I do is I don't ever throw away the scrap part until after I'm finished, because sometimes you might want to take this part and you can trim it down to different sizes and use it. Sometimes you need a little piece to kind of squeeze in. Okay, so the next step that we are going to do for the T-shirt quilt making is, once we have it all cut, we're going to take a large ruler, and I usually use a ruler that is much larger. If you don't have a big ruler, I used to, back a long time ago, make a template with a piece of cardboard, and I would just make it 15 or 16 inches, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to rough cut it, and then we're going to take the 12-inch ruler that I'm going to use, and then we'll be able to get it exactly how we want it. Okay, so now we're going to take the rotary cutter, and sometimes you can use an old blade. If you have some old blades laying around, these really will dull your blade. And so what I do is I just go from the right side, and then I kind of put my arm over it so that it doesn't move, and then I do the top. And I make sure that the top of the ruler is as close to the top of the collar, because almost always your images from your T-shirt are going to be very close to the top, and you're going to have a lot of room down on the bottom. So make sure that you get your top as straight as you can. And then I just kind of eyeball this side. I do not care if it's exactly, and then same thing with the bottom. Then I take my scraps away. And so if you notice on the corners, it's not perfectly square, and that's okay, because we're going to trim it down later. So this is just kind of a rough cut. Okay, so now we have this one done, and let's start a second one. Okay, so now that we have our shirts all cut out, we're just going to do two for the camera here. We are going to add the interfacing. This is the one that I use. There are a lot of different brands out there, and so you use whatever you prefer. This is what I use. I use a 906F fusible interfacing. It will be linked down in the description box for you. I usually buy big rolls, or when I used to do a lot of T-shirt quilts, I would buy big rolls of it. But this is actually really handy because they're already 15 inches, and so it makes it really easy to cut out. So this part you're going to need the iron. Basically, we're going to apply this interfacing, and the reason that we're doing this is because T-shirt quilts have a lot of stretch and they're kind of hard to work with. And so what this interfacing is going to do is it's going to go onto the wrong side of the T-shirts, and it's going to make it a lot easier to handle, and it'll kind of make it feel more like a cotton where it doesn't have nearly as much stretch. And so this 906F, you just apply heat to it at first, then you give it a little bit of steam, then it stays on there and it makes the t-shirts really easy to work with. And so this is an example of one. And so you'll see, because we rough cut it, it's okay if there's that extra. And so from the back side, this is what it's gonna look like. And so it makes it really easy to not have a ton of stretch. Okay, so the next step in making a t-shirt quilt is actually getting the interfacing onto the back of the shirt. And so there's a couple of different options. You can use your regular iron that you have at home. If you have a spare iron, I usually would suggest using that, because if you have a really nice iron, sometimes the interfacing could get onto the iron. Or this is a heat press, and what these are used for is when you're making a shirt. And so some people or companies have these because they're going to put this image that's on the shirt, it's a vinyl piece, and they're gonna put it onto the t-shirt. And so that's what these are for. And I decided to purchase one for myself because at one point I was making a lot of t-shirt quilts. And so monetarily speaking, it made sense to just go ahead and invest in one of these. And I'm gonna link it down on the bottom so you can see the options for regular iron versus this. You can actually make shirts with this, and when we do the interfacing, it just saves a lot of time, because that's one of the reasons why I cut the shirts out around 15 or 16 inches, and so it hangs over exactly. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put the t-shirt on there, we're gonna put the interfacing on there, and then we're gonna close the lid and get that interfacing to go onto the back of the shirt. I'm gonna cut this and I'll be right back. Okay, so since we're using this interfacing that is already 15 inches, it goes perfectly on the top here. We're going to take our scissors and just rough cut it. So the interfacing has a good side and a bad side, or a wrong and a right. And if you feel it with your hands, the one that has kind of the it's more rough, that's where the sticky stuff is. So that's the side that we want to face down onto the shirt, because if you do it the other way, it's gonna go on your regular iron or onto the heat press, and that is not what you want. What I do, and also a little trick that I do, is I take an old towel and I cut it into a 15-inch square, and I put this over the top. What I usually do is actually get it wet under the sink, get it wet, kind of wring it out so that it's damp, because that steam will help the interfacing connect better. Sometimes you'll put it on there with your iron and it looks really good, and then an hour or so later you'll look at it and it's kind of not on there quite so good, so add a little bit more heat to it. So since we're on the set, you can use just a water bottle and squirt it. But so what we're gonna do the first time is we're gonna go and we're gonna push it down. And this one has a timer on it. I usually do it about 3, 4, 5 seconds, something like that. And then it's on there. And so then at this point, I take the spray bottle, add a little bit of water. This is just regular old water. Since this doesn't have the water on it, it's not as effective, but the steam, it'll still be there. And since I have an extra layer in there, I'm just gonna hold it like that. It has where you can kind of clamp it down, but I'm just gonna hold it. And then we're gonna lift it up, and then it's on there. And so see, you've lost a lot of the stretch. Then we're gonna trim it down with the other smaller ruler. Okay, so now I'm gonna show you the second option, using your regular iron at home and your ironing board. It takes a little bit longer, and so you're gonna have to kind of do it in sections. I also use parchment paper because you're dealing with something that has glue and stickiness. You don't want to get that on your iron, so you can use parchment paper. You can also use parchment paper on the heat press. So remember, we're gonna do the rough side down, which is the sticky part. When you're dealing with a regular ironing board, it's a little bit easier. And so we're gonna start on a side and just make sure that it's flat, and then go over. And so you're gonna need to leave it there for a couple of seconds. And so that brings me into talking about how many shirts to use. So I have people ask me all the time, and the answer is pretty much any amount of shirts. You can do a whole quilt and add in 2 or 3 shirts if, say, that's all you have. You can add regular blocks, and you can add in, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 shirts that you have, or you can do sets of 3, 3, 3, and you know, if you want to just do like 9 shirts or 12 shirts. I have done up to 80 t-shirts on one t-shirt quilt on the front. And so right here, I've gotten myself a little crimp. What you can do is you can just kind of pull it. This doesn't normally happen very often when you're on a regular ironing board because you've got a little more space. And so I think I can get this. There we go. We did it. Okay, and so once you get that on there, then kind of same thing. I know that your iron has water in it and there is a little bit of steam in there, but I still usually do this. And this is the point where you can do the parchment paper. You can do it really at any point, whatever makes you feel more comfortable, but just kind of showing you an option. But it does really need steam to get it to stay on more permanently the way that you want it to. I think we're ready. Look at that. Okay, and so now we're gonna trim them out and get them the exact size that we want them. Okay, so now we have a pile of t-shirts that have the interfacing on them. We're gonna trim them down to 12 inches with the ruler. We're gonna leave them all the same size. There's a lot of options with t-shirt quilts, and I'll talk about some of that in a second. As I mentioned before, a lot of times there's not very much space at the top and there's more space down on the bottom. So I'm gonna make them 12 inches. And so I'm gonna make sure that the ruler has enough on the top so that I don't cut anything off. I'm gonna try to make it straight and then that way. So there's probably gonna be more space on the bottom where it's not gonna be completely centered. By the time it gets into a whole full quilt, it's gonna look fine. So again, I'm right-handed, so I'm gonna start on the right side and then I just put my arm on the top, keep my fingers out of the way, go over, and then I still just use my hand to push down, and then from here, and just go slow on that part so that you don't wiggle it, and then we have our block. And then let's do a couple of these, and then I'll show you some of the options to putting them together. At this point, we're not gonna have a lot of room on either side, and so this is personal preference. I don't really care if I chop the very top of this little flame off. It's just a matter of, what you want to do with each shirt, how much, how important it is, that kind of thing. Because if you wanted to make this one a little bit bigger and add it in. So there's a lot of options that we can talk about. So when I do t-shirt quilts, I either make them all the same size or I do kind of a variable placement. That's what I call it anyway. Meaning I cut each shirt the size that I want to and I make it kind of like a puzzle. When you cut them all the same size, what you can do is you can do rows of 3 or like I talked about a few minutes ago, rows of 4, rows of 5, whatever you want to do. And you can do sashing in between, that's as small as 1 inch, or you can go as big as 3 inches. That part is up to you, how big or small you want to make your quilt. I usually just do 2.5. You can buy jelly rolls, and so you can make it real easy. Gray is a real good color. I usually use Zen Gray, it's my favorite. That's a great color to go in between. It blends with a lot of different colors, or you can go regular white in between. And so you can just cut them and they can go in between each block. And so here is an example of how we would do that. And so then it kind of becomes just like a regular quilt. It's just like working with a 12-inch block that you've made from any of the books or patterns that you already have. It's just a matter of adding sashing and a border if you want to, or not a border, whatever you want to do. Okay, so we are almost ready to sew. We're going to talk about what we're going to use here. And so I'm going to do sashing. I'm going to do the 2.5-inch strips for the sashing right now. And the tools that I'm going to use are Aurifil thread. This is the 50 weight thread. And I'm just going to use color 2000 because most of these shirts are worn out and old and it will be fine. I'm a big fan of the Oregon brand needles. I use a 90-14 almost all the time, but because these t-shirt quilts are a little bit thicker and heavier, I'm definitely going to use a 90-14 needle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a couple of strips. Even though we put the interfacing on, there's still going to be a little bit of stretch, and when they get into the machine, there's still going to be a little bit of tug and pull more so than with regular cotton fabric. So really try not to freak out if there is a little bit of stretch or pull or whatnot. So it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm gonna cut off some 12-inch strips. I'm actually gonna leave, this is a 12.5-inch ruler, and I'm gonna leave it at 12.5. And I'm gonna cut a couple strips. And I'm gonna put those back on the pile. And when you're doing this at home, I usually lay them out on the floor, or if you have a big table to kind of decide. I always like to, with T-shirt quilts, there's always a lot of different colors. Sometimes you have a lot of white or gray and only a couple of colors. And so what you wanna do is arrange them so that you like the colors. I sometimes like to take a picture after I have it laid out on the floor, and you can kind of see the way that your color looks from far away. And so when you look at a picture, sometimes that helps you see where the color is arranged. I'm going to, since there's a gray here and a color here, I'm gonna put the gray in the center. On the other row, I wouldn't wanna probably put the gray right next to the gray. I'd probably put this obnoxious yellow there, and then maybe the gray here, or in the blue over here. And so I would just kind of pay attention to that part when you're doing T-shirt quilts. So what we're gonna do is, since we're doing 2.5-inch strips, it doesn't really matter where you start. I'm not a big pinner, I almost never pin. So I'm gonna take this to the machine, and so I've just put it on there, and it's not exactly on either side because you're probably gonna have to trim it down later anyway. And so I am going to just do a 1/4 inch. And you can do a little more than a 1/4 inch if you think that it's necessary. I don't like to iron more than a 1/4 inch. It just seems like a lot to me. So once we get that piece on there, and then I would put the second piece over here. So there we've got that, and that's what we're gonna do in between each shirt to make the rows. So one's gonna go here, and then we're gonna use the same 2.5-inch size here, and then we're gonna do a second row, so just like we do with regular quilts. And when I'm sewing the T-shirt quilts, I usually do things at a 1.5 to 1.8 stitch length, so that works really well. So as I'm sewing on the interfacing of this one, I noticed that I did a little bit of a strip. I was out, I did a couple of these before I came to the set, and I had a piece that I didn't want to waste. So I just pieced in a little section of the interfacing. So it does not have to be 15 inches square and perfect. No one's ever gonna see this or know, and so you can definitely add in pieces, 2 or 3 pieces. If you're at the end and you have almost enough, you can totally overlap it, and that's fine. Okay, so at this point we have 3 t-shirts joined together with sashings in the center. And when I do t-shirt quilts, I always press them open. I am not a presser opener. I don't like to press open. But for this, I usually do, because it's so bulky. If you try to press it open, it ends up being too much. So I always press them open. So once you get these shirts here, we're gonna do the sashing from the jelly roll. And I have 3 shirts here. If you're gonna do more, then you would just wanna join 2 pieces of your jelly roll together for your sashing and your border, unless you wanted to do, a different border. But I usually use this on the whole sashing and border and everything. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about some different options. I always have a lot of people ask me about what we do and what about this, and if there's a small piece, so I'm gonna just talk about some of the things that I have learned through making a lot of these t-shirt quilts. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is when you have a shirt that has a front and a back. Sometimes the back is huge, sometimes the front is small, and or there's just, you know, like a little emblem or something on the breast area or whatnot. And so this is where this will kind of come into play. And so you can cut, like we just did, you can cut the 12-inch square for, you know, for one side, and then you can take the smaller section, like for instance this piece right here. This was from the front of the shirt, and you can see that the collar is still on there, but it's got a little small section. And maybe this shirt didn't have anything on the back of it, and you wanted to remember this memory from going to this concert. And so this is a good way to kind of make one block out of smaller sections of the shirt. And so all of these were little sections of the shirts that I just worked with and showed you. And so they have smaller areas that you wouldn't really want to do on a whole 12-inch piece, but you want to add them together. What we will do is these are cut out 6.5 inches, and so you can add them together. And once you get the interfacing on them, and then you'd cut this one out the same, and then one of the other ones, and then you can make one square with the different sections of, you know, like the sleeve of a shirt or something, if they're, you know, something you want to save but it's not quite big enough. What I usually do is I take the bottoms of the shirts and I just lay them out on the cutting board, and I cut them. You know, you can do 2.5 or 3.5 or whatever size you want to do, but they're great to use with a lot of the paper that the Fat Quarter Shop sells, the foundation paper. That's what I do. I always try to use this extra part, and what we can do with that is make a block. And so I did not do interfacing on the backs of these, so that's why they're kind of curled up. So that's it's a fun way to use the scraps, and because you're using the paper, you don't have to do the interfacing as much. It's still a little bit hard to work with, but it's doable. And so this way you could add in a lot of the pieces from your t-shirts that you've been making and make blocks. And so that's what this one is right here. This is the log cabin paper, and it's a 12-inch, so it'll match the other t-shirts that we cut down to 12. And so let's say you only had 15 or 12 and you really wanted to make it a little bit bigger, you could add in, you know, a block or two to make yourself fit and be as big as you want it to be. So we can also do the flying geese. You can do oodles of them and make your border with a bunch of flying geese. You could do in between each shirt, you can do, you know, 1, 2, 3 in between. There's a lot of things that you can do, especially with all the different types of foundation paper that the Fat Quarter Shop stocks. So you already have some of those, and if you don't, grab some and try them out. And you know what? I also get a lot of questions from people about what do I do if I have shirts that aren't t-shirts, because they're not really sure. And so one of the things with those types of shirts, and these, as a lot of them are cotton and sometimes they're flannel, but they're really, really great, kind of like what I talked about a few minutes ago with the papers. And so you can take these types of shirts, this one's cotton, these are flannels, and you can take them and you can use them in all kinds of different blocks. And when I do these kinds of shirts, I usually cut off the sleeves first, and then I cut the seam off of the armpit of your shirt, and then you can lay it out and iron it, and you can cut them into, say, like 4-inch squares or 5-inch squares, and you can just do little patchwork pieces. Or I love to do the crazy paper. This is actually the very first t-shirt quilt that I made out of baby clothes, and I used the crazy quilt technique. And it's really great because when you're cutting out shirts, a lot of times they're not all the same size, and then they're just little pieces, and you end up, you know, with like the sleeve or the collar. Or I even did one once where I did the pocket from a pair of jeans, and I put the pocket in the center, and then I built around it with the fabrics. And so these are really great ways to use the crazy paper, and they look super fun because there's a lot of different colors and different textures, and it's a really great way to use some of the other fabrics that you'll find in shirts that aren't t-shirts. And I have also done a blog post previously about some of the t-shirt quilts that I have made. And one of the sections on my blog, I have it on the floor and it's kind of a mess, and I've got different quadrants of the quilt, of this one actually, on the floor. And it kind of will show you and help you understand a little bit more about putting them together when they're not all the same size. the one that's behind me, I made this for my son, and he's a teenager now, and so a lot of these quilts made me just get really emotional because I thought about, you know, like field day where we went and some of those things. So they're a really, really great way to preserve those memories for the moms and the grandmas and the dads and the uncles and aunts, and, you know, so you can remember those kind of things, and that really makes it a lot of fun. I would love for you to follow me. I'm one of the long arm quilters here at the Fat Quarter Shop, and I love to make samples and then do a lot of other sewing besides long arm quilting. So I'd love for you to follow me. You can find me at threadgraffiti.com, and I have a blog, and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you.